I'm going to, before I start on my presentation, kind of echo something that Ernie Barnett said about this is a little nostalgic, but I'm looking at every table, and I think that half of the room, we either work together or we work together either at St. John's or South Florida, and it's great to see people that are continuing their careers in water resources and dedicated to moving things along. Ernie Marks, you warmed my heart if you're still here. Have wondered for years why more emphasis wasn't put on the Northern Everglades. And the Northern Everglades is such a very important part of the Everglades ecosystem and is the source of the phosphorus coming into Lake Okeechobee. And why people don't talk about that, I don't know. A short story, it was Ernie Barnett, and since he's not here, I can talk about him. Robert Coker and I were at Andrew's, do you know where that is? That little restaurant in Tallahassee, when a group of wonderful people were talking about how to get more funding for the estuaries and for the Kissimmee River area. And Robert just popped up with, well, let's call it the Northern Everglades because it sounds sexy. And, you know, but it is kind of a sexy term, but it was an accurate term. And it was a compelling term, and so very few people probably know who coined that phrase, and least expected person maybe, but it caught on and it resonated, and it's just really, from a personal standpoint, wonderful to see the emphasis on north of Lake Okeechobee and the estuaries, because it's a very, very important part of Everglades ecosystem. I am here today in my role as senior consultant for Poseidon, and I want to talk about money. Money is one of my absolute favorite things. Frank Bernardino can tell you that. Ever since we worked together when he was at South Florida and I was at St. John's, we were always looking for other people's money, and let's get money and let's build projects. And while I was good, Frank was really good at getting the money, and I really enjoyed working with him and learning from Frank, walking the halls in Tallahassee. Do I have a clicker? Is this it? Ta-da, there we go. Let's talk a little bit about Poseidon Water. Poseidon Water is a developer. They're the leading developer in the United States of water infrastructure from a private perspective. They were founded in 1995. Their headquarters is in Boston, and that's my hometown, so I love sometimes going up there and visiting with them. Great city. They are the developers of the 50 MGD desal plant Carlsbad for the San Diego Water Authority. It's an award-winning ocean water desal project that has been online now for 2.5 years and is operating well, and really a flagship project for them. They are public-private partner specialist. They bring money to the table. They design, operate, permit, maintain, build, everything. Soup to nuts, they do the project. And the most important thing is they bring private capital to the table. And one of the things that's important about them is they don't design, they don't build, they are the developer. And they're in a unique position to assess a project and bring the best technology, the best solutions to whatever project they are considering to the table. And I've watched them over the years do this, and they're very particularly effective in putting the right team together for whatever project that they're contemplating. They work in all kinds of water. While they're known particularly for desal, they also do traditional water supply and wastewater, and they're also in the process of looking at septic to sewer conversion programs. So they kind of go the gamut when in terms of water projects. They are now owned by Brookfield. Brookfield is like the big boys, and Brookfield is in infrastructure management, real estate, infrastructure of all kinds, private equity, and power. And if you look, they manage on an annual basis billions and billions of dollars of private equity infrastructure. So what is the issue? In the United States, and the reason why I want to talk about this is I want to put it in context. Florida is not the only state that is dealing with water supply issues. Everybody in the United States is dealing with water supply issues of some sort. In the United States, there are 54,000 drinking water systems. There's over 1 million miles of water mains and chronic leaks. There are a lot of maintenance issues that people are dealing with. There are 19,500 sanitary sewer systems. There's over 600,000 miles of sewer pipe and over 30,000 pressurized force mains. These are stress systems. I went to the American Society of Civil Engineers report. They do a report card all the time, so I went to the latest one that they have published, is 2017. And in 2017, the United States drinking water systems received a grade of D. There are 240,000 water main breaks annually in the United States. 6 billion gallons of treated water are lost annually to leaking. So we're losing a tremendous amount. We get the water, we treat it, we distribute it, and we lose it before it gets to the customer. $1 trillion is needed in the next 25 years to maintain and expand. So what the American Society of Civil Engineers was documenting in their report, there's a huge backlog of underfunded maintenance. But also, there is new growth that is going to occur. So local governments are having the challenge of looking at how do we fund getting our systems up to their standards where they should be. At the same time, how do we come up with the funding to expand our facilities because we have a growing population. In 2017, the report for wastewater, they did a little better. They got a D+. Not really a great position to be in. 56 million more people are expected to connect to centralized treatment by 2032. And there's over a $270 billion need for both the current and the future demand. So we're looking at really large dollars. What is the problem? The problem is all over the United States we have aging infrastructure, and this is going to be repeated, aging infrastructure where we have not kept up with the operation and maintenance of these facilities, underfunded maintenance. And I think that almost every utility director in the United States probably laments about this because a lot of times where you have competing interests with a county or a city, not always are the operation and maintenance needs for these plants given a priority or the priority that they need. Chronic underinvestment in the facilities. Maintenance deferral. Growth pressures. So especially in Florida, growth started to slow down a little bit. We're starting to see growth pick up again. There's hardly a city now where you're driving down the road. There's new apartment buildings being built. There's transportation projects. There's homes being built. Where I live in Highlands County. Highlands County is small, but for a couple of years, I don't think there was a building permit pulled. And now you see new construction everywhere. So growth is starting to occur again. Remember when we did the water supply planning? Right before the slowdown in the economy, we were predicting crisis for a number of cities, a number of counties that they had not adequately identified, nor had they begun the planning or the project development for the water supply that they would need about 10 years down the road. Well, they got a little bit of a reprieve, didn't they? For two reasons. One, the growth slowed down. Growth didn't occur as quickly as we originally thought, but also very aggressive water conservation programs were put in place in partnership between the water management districts and the cities and the counties. So they got a little cushion in the allocation that they had. That's going away. The population is coming, and all of those predictions that we had about 10 years ago, we're starting to pay attention to them because we're looking at that. Environmental concerns. More and more cities, more and more utilities around the country are getting consent orders from EPA, and we have ever-changing regulatory criteria for people to meet in those consent orders. So, a solution, private capital. Private capital, if you read the American Society of Civil Engineers report, it talks about there's a delta. They have identified, or they're projecting, about $150 billion in the next couple of years of infrastructure investment that needs to occur. And about $54 billion has been identified as coming from local governments, and there's a deficit. And a lot of people are always looking at, hey, Let's go to the state. Let's create a program. Let's get the state legislature to fund water supply. Well, you know what? I don't want to tell you how old I was when I began going to Tallahassee and trying to get those water supply programs put in place. Remember Senate Bill 444? And everybody got so excited. 95% of all water supply projects in the United States are funded by utility rates. 5% comes from other people's money. The federal government and the state governments are not going to be the majority funder for water supply projects. It's an important part of the funding stream. It's something that you should aggressively pursue, and it's something that we hope that state and federal governments continue to support, but it's not going to be the major source of funding. And capital, private capital, is going to become part of the solution, I think, in the next 10 years. So how are we going to do that? When does a private capital model make sense? Not all times, not all places, not all projects. There are some cities and counties this is not going to work. But where have we found there is a compelling reason for us to enter into a partnership with the public sector? When there is a consent decree, you have a deadline, maybe the solution is a new technology. You could have, for example, a utility that consistently has done a great job with surface water, and they're doing good, and the treatment plant is up to speed, and they have great employees. But guess what? That next increment of improvement for them to comply with the consent decree might be reverse osmosis, and they've never done it before. So they enter into a partnership with the private sector and transfer the risk of developing a new technology to meet their consent order. Or maybe it's just that the deadline is so tight, you transfer that risk to the private sector to put an expedited program together so that water is delivered according to the deadline for the consent decree. Financial constraints. You have some communities that are kind of hitting their debt cap, and going to the market and getting additional debt is not going to be on their menu. So how do they address that? They can enter into a partnership with the private sector, and the private sector brings private capital to the table. And even though there would be an agreement between the local government and the private sector, this is not considered part of their debt cap. And this is recognized by Moody's and Standard & Poor's. And sometimes, interestingly enough, when we do these kinds of transactions, it actually improves the credit rating of the local government. Underinvestment or operational or maintenance challenges. So you have a local government for years. The interesting practice of transferring to the general fund has occurred, and some of those major maintenance issues just get deferred year after year after year, and all of a sudden, guess what? You're in a situation where that plant, whether it be a wastewater treatment plant or a water plant, you can't do, it's like timeout, guys. You have to get this plant going. It's very difficult to then do a giant rate increase with your public to immediately invest in the capital, bring that plant up to the standards. You can enter into a contract with the private sector, a longer-term contract where they can expense that out over a longer period of time, stretch out that rate increase, come in, do the analysis, the upgrades, maybe even the expansion of the plant, do the operation, the maintenance, and take this burden off of the local government. Implementation of new technology. Say, you know, the next increment is a new technology that you don't have experience with, and you're worried about, is it going to work? That technology transfers to the private sector. The private sector is held responsible for the implementation. And remember, in these agreements with the private sector, if the private sector doesn't deliver the water, the public sector doesn't pay. And we're going to talk about that a little later. So the risk is truly transferred to the private sector. An accelerated schedule. You have a deadline. That deadline could be because of a consent order, or it could be because the population has grown faster than you anticipated, and you really, really need to get that water supply project or that wastewater treatment project online before you're in maybe a moratorium situation. The private sector has the ability, because you, the public, would enter into a contract. That's it. That's the only vote that your local government has to make, is to contract. You're not going out on the street to do a design contract and, you do the RFP, you do the advertisement, you bring people in. It's time to do the construction. You bring the construction contract out on the street, and the whole thing. This is a very expedited schedule. Every discipline that you need from soup to nuts is part of the team. One contract, one negotiation, and then they're off and running. A regional project. So I know the legislature and the water management districts are encouraging regional solutions. Sometimes there isn't a governance that exists for those regional solutions to be implemented. And maybe you don't want a government to be put in place that is going to grow into a large government. You can do a regional project where the contract is with multiple governments with the private sector. But once again, you have that one contract. There's an agreement, kind of like a take or pay in the power field. And that contract then is one where the private sector will design, build, operate, maintain the facility. The contract is to deliver, say, wholesale water to each one of those government entities. You don't need to have a governance for that. It's ruled by a contract, and that's another opportunity. So let's talk about two private capital models. There's many, but there's two that we want to talk about today that we have a lot of expertise in. What is a negotiated public-private partnership? And I'm going to read this. I hate reading PowerPoint slides, but this is a long definition, and I think it's important. A negotiated public-private partnership, or negotiated P3, is a contractual arrangement between the public agency, the private partner. It allows for greater private sector participation in the delivery and financing of the public water resource-based infrastructure projects. And in this one, it is not privatization, because the public sector is the one who is in the contract, and at the end, and we'll talk about this later, the facility, the assets are transferred back to the public sector. But during this period of time, the private sector does own it, and then it goes back to the public sector. A concession model. A concession is a method of delivering public infrastructure where significant the risks are transferred to the private sector. The public agency retains the asset ownership. And I think particularly in Florida, this is important because the local government will retain the ownership and a high degree of involvement and oversight, while the private sector provides services according to an individually negotiated performance-based contract. So those are key. The private sector owns it. The private sector will retain rate-setting ability. The private sector will have their staff that does periodic inspections, develops the relationship with the private sector, and makes sure that all pre-negotiated terms, which will include the design, the construction, materials, and the level to which it's maintained and operated consistently, that will be the responsibility to make sure the local government is involved in making in those contract negotiated terms being implemented, and the private sector will operate. And in a negotiated concession, once again, the private sector will bring the money to the table. In the first dollar that the local government spends is when the water is delivered. Those dollars are collected from the ratepayers, and then those payments are made to the private sector. There is no upfront expense for the public. Private capital overview. So what are the steps? First, the development. The private and the public partner work together to develop the project. So you will have a team. The public sector will have a team. You'll have some engineers, engineer of record on your side, and you'll sit down and talk about what is the project going to look like, what is the treatment going to look like, if it's reverse osmosis, what kind of membranes are we going to use, what is the treatment train, everything. And then the private sector will assume the risk and the responsibility for getting the permits, and we will work together to establish the final pricing for the project, which is not just the construction. Remember, this is soup to nuts. This is a 20-year to 40-year relationship, and it will include the operation and maintenance. Construction, the private partner managed everything. We manage the engineers of record, we do the project procurement, we do all the construction contracts, and we make sure that it's delivered on time, on budget, according to the pre-negotiated specifications that were requested by the local government. We do risk transfer. The public partner only pays, this is really critical, if the private partner meets the performance obligations. So if there's a part of the contract and we don't deliver, you don't pay. You don't pay until all those contract requirements are met. The private partner serves as the single point of responsibility for the project. How many times do you have a project where the engineer designs it, somebody else builds it, something goes wrong with the project, the engineer blames the contractor blames the engineer? You don't have that in this model because Poseidon is 100% responsible for the project. We're responsible for the engineer, we're responsible for the contractor, we're responsible for the operator. We resolve those issues, we're responsible for delivering. That is not your, on your side of the ledger sheet. Financing. The private partner provides the funding. We bring the funding to the table, we finance the project. We are flexible. So talk about other people's money, my favorite thing. If you get a grant from the state or the federal government, we will factor that in and we will bring that to the table and we'll sit down with the local government and we'll talk about things such as, okay, now you have a grant. As we build our financial model, do you want that grant to offset the capital costs and bring the initial rate down? Do you want us to expense that grant over the life of the project to flatten the rate increases? See, we're bringing the money to the table, and we have the flexibility to reflect what your community would like. Maybe you want to hold the rate flat for the first 5 years and then do a step function. We have the flexibility to bring other federal, state, any kind of grants, water management district grants into a project. The debt burden is on our side of the ledger sheet. We have an expedited schedule because we don't go through the traditional procurement process. Everybody is at the table from the beginning. We do all the operation and maintenance and capital improvement according to pre-negotiated standards. Public ownership. The project assets in a public ownership or in a concession agreement are transferred over to the public partner at the end of the lease. In a P3, we own it until the end of the agreement, at which time the project assets are transferred over to the public ownership. Here's some considerations. Maintenance, just to repeat it, the standards are pre-agreed upon between the local government and the private sector. Employees, the jobs can transition to the private sector. We guarantee that the level of benefits that they have now will be the same or better than what they have with the local government. But we also have flexibility. I'll tell you one of the #1 issues that comes up. You know what? I have an employee that's an FRS. They have 29 years in. If they become a public sector employee, they're going to lose that magic 30. We will work with you to keep that employee on the public side so that they can continue. Why do you do that? Because it's respectful of employee and it shows that you respect the employees and the people that get transferred. I mean, it's just the right thing to do, and that's how Poseidon likes to have a partnership. This isn't just a business relationship, it's a partnership. Control, that we negotiate. How much control does the local government want to keep and how much control do they want to pass on? How much risk do you want to pass on? Additional potential contract terms. So you have a procurement policy and you require 30% local participation in all your contracts. We pick all those provisions up so that our contract looks like your contract. We have a contract in California where they require all their contracts have green energy. So we put that into our contract because we want to be the same. We don't want to be open to criticism, and we want to reflect the values of the local community. We absolutely positively consider this a partnership. It's transparent. All the books are open in the negotiations. There's joint messaging and joint participation, and we become a team. So real quick, concession examples, Cranston, Rhode Island was a wastewater treatment plant. They had a consent order, and they had an unfunded pension fund. We went in and we took over on a 25-year lease, though it's worked so well, they've extended it to 2027. We did an upfront payment. We paid off all of their existing debt, which is part of what we do. We also increased that payment to cover their unfunded pension fund, and you can see the numbers here. It's been incredibly successful. Bayonne, New Jersey, same thing. This is a smaller facility that we did. This is a 40-year plant, but we were able to remove all of the debt, existing debt for this wastewater treatment plant from the city's balance sheet. Middletown, Pennsylvania, $83 million capital investment that we had to do for this particular. There's ongoing annual lease payments. Once again, we removed all the debt, and we removed the unfunded portion of the utilities pension plan. That's something else. If you have, this is a unique opportunity to provide funding for something else in your city or your county by folding it into the deal and having an upfront payment, and we've done this in the past. Carlsbad is a negotiated P3. I say negotiated because it's very, very similar to a concession. It's just that the ownership is on the side of the private sector. San Diego Water Authority, if there is anybody in this room that doesn't know that California has water supply issues, raise your hand. I'd love to meet you and talk to you sometime afterwards and ask you where you've been living. So what they wanted was a drought-proof source of water. They decided to go to ocean water desal. They had never done a project like this before. They wanted to transfer the technology risk. It's a great San Diego Water Authority, the real deal. They operate well, great staff, no reason why they couldn't do it themselves. They wanted to transfer the risk to the private sector. So it's a 54 MGD seawater plant plus a 10-mile pipeline that didn't go flat. It went up a hill. Unlike in Florida, they go flat. This went up a hill. They did the whole thing: design, build, finance, own, operate, maintain. And I know the permitting was particularly challenging in California with some of the coastal environmental community, and but they were able to permit it. It's now drought-proof, and once again, the Water Authority, because of this, they had a great rating. They had AA+, but they've gone to a AAA after they were able to do this particular project. You can see that there was a water purchase agreement. There's some interesting issues with electricity charges in California. You know, electricity is a big part of a reverse osmosis or desal plant. They negotiated those charges into the contract, and you can see that the total cost of the project, capital and operating. But electric was a big part of this project. This one's won awards everywhere. It's a great project. It's incredibly successful. They've been delivering the water. And once again, I know that last summer, because of algae near the intake pipe, that they had to reduce their production. And you know what happened? Exactly what the contract called for. San Diego Water Authority did not have to pay for the water. All of that was on the side of Poseidon. So it is working exactly the way that it was negotiated. So with that, because I saw that you stood up, and I know that means that we've got to hurry, and I'm standing between you, and I don't think you're staying for lunch, probably going home. I will be here, or I'm available to answer any questions that you may have.